The cold reaches you before anything else does. Not the cold of a drafty room or a morning that has not yet warmed. Something older than that. Something that has been here long before the war, gave it a context, and will be here long after the war has been absorbed into the ground with everything else the ground has accepted. This is the cold of the Karelian forest in late November 1939, which is a different category of cold entirely. It enters the lungs like something with an intention. It turns breath into vapor before the breath has finished leaving the body. At night it makes the birch trees crack like rifle shots in the darkness. And the first time you hear it, you reach for a weapon, and the second time you understand, and the third time, you have stopped flinching, and by then you are already something the cold has changed. The snow is deep enough to swallow a man to the knee in places, and in the forest, it carries its own light, not the reflected light of a clear sky, but something interior, something that seems to come from within the snow itself, as though the ground beneath it is still trying to say something, through the only medium available to it, in winter. The pines hold their weight of white without complaint, the way things accustomed to bearing weight hold it. Not with effort, but with the practiced patience of things that have been doing this for a very long time. The birches stand thinner and paler, their bark the color of old paper, their branches making small precise gestures in the wind that crosses the Kola River and moves through the tree line and finds every gap in every coat and settles there. The forest is not empty. The Finnish forest in winter is never empty. It is full of what it does not show you. The depth of it, the shadows that sit between the trees at a distance where your eyes cannot resolve them into anything specific. The particular quality of a wilderness that keeps its own counsel and has no obligation to explain itself to the people passing through it. Birds have settled back into the upper branches. A hare has moved through the clearing to the east and left its track in the snow, and continued on to wherever hares go when the world is occupied with other things. And in the snow, barely a disturbance, less a presence than the suggestion of one, a figure lies still. He has been here since before first light. The snow around the outline of his white-clad body has begun to integrate him the way snow integrates everything eventually, softening the hard edge between a man and the landscape he is lying in, until the distinction becomes a matter of degree, rather than kind. The birds above him settled back into the trees an hour ago. They have decided he is not a thing that moves. They are, for now, correct. He is 33 years old. He was born on December the 17th, 1905, in a farming municipality called Rauchevi, the seventh of 8. Children in a Lutheran family whose relationship with this land was not sentimental but total. The kind of relationship that forms between people in a place when the place is the source of everything, when the forest is the calendar, and the larder, and the measure of a man. He grew up pacing distances, until his body held them without calculation. He grew up learning to read wind through grass, and to move through the underbrush, without announcing himself to the things he was moving toward. He grew up patient, in the specific way that the land teaches patience. Not as virtue, but as method. Not as goodness, but as the simple understanding that the world comes to you if you are still enough to receive it. He is not a soldier by nature. He is a farmer and hunter. And the difference between what he was then and what the forest has made use of him becoming is a difference that no medal and no newspaper has ever adequately explained, and the man himself has never tried. Somewhere, behind the tree line to the east, a Soviet column is moving on the only road through the forest. He knows this. He has done this calculation before. The distance, the wind, the particular quality of light on snow at this hour, the rate at which a man in a dark coat moving across the white ground resolves from shadow into target. He has done the calculation so many times that it is no longer a calculation. It is simply a thing the body knows. He keeps a private record. He does not call it a record of service or a tally of efficiency, or any of the words the newspapers will eventually reach for. He calls it, in the language he uses, when no one is listening, his sin list. The forest is quiet. The figure in the snow has not moved, and whatever comes next has already begun. Rautiavi is not a place that appears on the maps people consult when they are trying to understand history. It is a municipality on the southeastern edge of Finland, close enough to the Russian border that on certain mornings the light over the tree line looks like it belongs to a different country, which, depending on the year and the treaty and the particular appetite of the empire to the east, it sometimes did. It is farming country and forest country, and the kind of place where those two things are not separate categories but aspects of the same life, where the fields end and the trees begin, and the people who live between them move through both with the matter-of-fact fluency of those who have never known anything else. Into this place, on December the 17th, 1905, Simo Heiha was born, the seventh of 8 children, a Lutheran household, a father who worked the land with the methodical seriousness of a man who understood that the land did not negotiate, that it gave back what you put in and not more, that its lessons were reliable precisely because they were indifferent to your feelings about them. This is not the origin story of someone exceptional. This is the origin story of someone ordinary, in the specific, deep way that only certain kinds of places produce, people who have been shaped by work and weather and patience, until those things are not qualities they possess, but qualities they are. The forest was the first classroom, not metaphorically, literally. Heiha learned to move through the Karelian woodland from childhood, accompanying his father on hunts that required something more demanding than marksmanship. The quarry of the Finnish forest, the black grouse, the capercaillie, were birds of extraordinary sensitivity, attuned to every disturbance in their environment, with the vigilance of things that understood themselves to be prey. To hunt them successfully required a hunter who could become, for the duration of the stalk, something closer to landscape than person, not merely quiet, not merely slow, but genuinely, biologically absent from the awareness of the thing being hunted, a presence so reduced it did not register as presence at all. He was good at this from a young age, not in the way of a prodigy. There was nothing showy about it, nothing that announced itself as talent. He was good at it the way water is good at finding the lowest point, through the simple, consistent operation of his nature, applied to the same problem, every day, until the problem was no longer a problem, but a condition of his movement through the world. He learned to read wind by watching it travel through the upper branches before it reached the ground. He learned to estimate distances by pacing them out on his father's farmland, hundreds of repetitions, until the gap between his body's sense of a distance and the actual measured truth of it narrowed to almost nothing. He learned that patience was not the absence of action, but a form of action, so sustained and so quiet it was invisible to everyone, except the man performing it. The civil guard, the suojeluskunta, was where the skills became documented. He joined in 1925 at the age of 19, completing his mandatory military service and staying connected to the organization in the years that followed through his competitive shooting record. He won, consistently, with the same absence of drama that characterized everything else about him. No celebration, no performance of his own ability, simply the placement of a bullet where the calculation required it to go, and then the quiet preparation for the next one. By the time the 1930s were well advanced, Heiha's name was known within Finnish shooting circles, not because he sought that recognition, but because the record made it unavoidable. He was a small man, 5 feet 3 inches. This detail matters for reasons that will become clear later in the snow, because the physics of concealment are unforgiving, and every centimeter of profile that can be reduced is a centimeter that might constitute the difference between a position that holds and a position that is found. He did not know this about himself in the way of someone who has calculated his advantages. He simply was what he was, in the particular unself-conscious way of people who have not yet been required to think of themselves as instruments of anything. He farmed, he hunted, he competed. He was, by every account his neighbours gave in the decades after the war, an unremarkable man in the best sense of the word. Someone whose days had the ordinary texture of a life organised around work and season, whose conversation was spare, and whose presence in a room was the presence of someone who was not performing himself for anyone's benefit. His friend in later years would say that Simo was more comfortable with animals and trees than with people, and this was not a criticism. It was simply an accurate description of a man whose earliest and most formative relationships had been with things that communicated in a language without words, in distance and wind and the precise quality of silence that tells you something is near before you can see it. And then the world outside Rautjärvi reorganized itself in ways that Rautjärvi could not ignore. In August of 1939, 2 foreign ministers sat down in Moscow and signed a document whose full contents would not be known to the public for decades. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with the brisk efficiency of men drawing lines on other people's maps. Finland fell within the Soviet sphere. What this meant, in the language the agreement translated into over the months that followed, was that Stalin would come to the Finnish table with demands. The demands were territorial: the Karelian Isthmus, several islands in the Gulf of Finland, a lease on the Hanko Peninsula. Stalin framed these requirements as security measures. The protection of Leningrad, which sat only 32 kilometers from the Finnish border, required a buffer. The Finnish negotiators understood what was being asked. They also understood what agreeing would mean for the integrity of a country that had only been independent since 1917. They refused. What followed was the shelling of Mainila, a Soviet artillery bombardment of the Soviet territory, staged to produce a casualty count that could be blamed on Finnish aggression and used as a pretext for war. The staging was transparent to anyone willing to look at the geography, which placed the alleged Finnish firing positions in locations from which the shells could not possibly have reached the Soviet village they allegedly struck. It did not matter. The Soviet Union withdrew its diplomats. On November the 30th, 1939, the Red Army crossed the Finnish border. The force that crossed was enormous on paper: 450,000 soldiers in the initial invasion, a number that would eventually grow to more than 1.5 million as the war extended beyond every Soviet timeline for it. 6,500 tanks against Finland's 30, 3,800 aircraft against 114. These were not the numbers of a contest. They were the numbers of an assumption. The assumption of a larger power that the question of this war had already been answered, that the crossing of the border was not the beginning of a conflict but the administrative formality of an inevitable conclusion. What the numbers concealed was the condition of the institution producing them. The Great Purge of 1937 and 1938 had moved through the Red Army's officer corps with the thoroughness of a catastrophe that is not accidental. More than 30,000 officers had been liquidated, arrested, shot, sent to labor camps, including 80% of the army's divisional and corps commanders. What crossed the Finnish border in November of 1939 was an army that had been decapitated of its experienced leadership and had not yet grown a replacement. It was an institution that outnumbered its opponent in every material category and was commanded, at its operational level, by men who owed their positions not to demonstrated competence, but to the survival of a purge. Stalin's generals had predicted a victory within 2 weeks. They had made this prediction without adequate accounting for what their army actually was beneath the numbers, and what the army was, concretely, on the ground in the Karelian forest in the first days of December, was this: soldiers in brown-green uniforms moving against white snow, road-bound, heavy vehicle dependent, restricted to the narrow corridors that Finnish terrain allowed for mechanized movement, poorly supplied for subarctic conditions, inadequately briefed on the environment they were entering, moving through a wilderness that the people defending it had spent their entire lives learning to read. Heiha received his mobilization papers in the autumn of 1939, before the invasion crossed the border, during the period of political deterioration, when the outcome of the diplomatic negotiations was still formally uncertain and informally not. He was 33 years old. He took his M2830 rifle, the Finnish Civil Guard variant of the Mosin Nagant, the rifle he had competed with, the rifle his body knew the way his body knew distance, and he reported to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, which would take up its position on the Kola riverfront. He did not give a speech. He did not record his feelings about what was coming in any document that survived. He was the kind of man for whom the space between a decision and its execution was not a space that required filling with language. He had been asked to go to the forest. He knew the forest. He went. The farm behind him. The birches ahead. The particular quality of Finnish winter light on snow at the hour before dawn, which is the light of a world that is mostly white and mostly silent, and that keeps with the patient indifference of things that have no stake in what happens on their surface, all of its counsel to itself. He walked into the trees. He did not know yet what the forest was going to ask of him. Neither did anyone else. But the forest knew. The forest always knows, in the way that places where a great deal of human suffering has occurred accumulate something of that suffering into their texture, into the quality of their silence, into the specific way their shadows sit between the trees in the hours when the light is thin and the cold is absolute, and the only sound is the sound of branches shifting under their weight of snow, and a man in white, barely a disturbance against all that white, taking up his position and going still. The Kola River runs through a landscape that seems designed, in retrospect, to punish the assumptions of an invading force. The ground in winter is frozen to a depth that makes digging into it essentially impossible. Not difficult, not laborious, but genuinely physically impossible in the way of things that have simply become something other than what tools are made to work with. The terrain is a maze of frozen marshes and lakes and dense forest corridors that funnel movement onto a small number of narrow roads. Roads that, in the Finnish winter, are not conveniences, but compulsions. The only surfaces on which mechanized equipment can function, the only routes through a wilderness that offers no alternative to those who have not learned to move through it, on skis, on foot in white, without roads at all, for an invading army dependent on vehicles and supply columns, and the kind of organizational momentum that requires predictable routes and reliable ground. The Kola front was a systematic nightmare. For a man who had spent 30 years learning the forest on its own terms, it was something closer to home. The Battle of Kola was not a single engagement, but a grinding 100-day struggle for a river line that the Finnish High Command understood to be essential. Lose the Kola, and the entire eastern flank of the Mannerheim line could be turned. The defensive architecture of the war unraveled from the edge. Major General Voldemar Hägglund, commanding the 4th Corps, asked Lieutenant Arne Juutilainen directly whether Kola would hold. Juutilainen's answer, "Kola holds, unless we are told to run," became a national phrase, the kind of sentence that a country at war reaches for when it needs to believe something. The men living inside that promise had a more immediate relationship with what it required. Heiha operated in this environment as a member of the 6th Company, Infantry Regiment 34. What he did there, specifically, technically, physically, is a story that the myth has consistently simplified into something more comfortable than the reality. The lone marksman, the legendary rifle, the impossible number. The reality was more deliberate than that, and more methodical, and more costly to the body performing it than any simplified account suggests. He began his days in darkness. Hours before first light, he would move to a pre-prepared position, moving through the trees, with the unhurried, weight-controlled step of someone who understood that the sound of movement in a silent forest travels farther than most people believe, and that the snow remembers pressure in ways that can be read by those who know how to read it. The position was not improvised. He had selected it in advance, assessed its sight lines, understood its relationship to the ground he expected to engage across, and to the cover available if the position needed to be abandoned. He settled into it in the dark and began the long, biological work of disappearing. The snow pit was shallow. Not a fortification, but a depression, a concavity that reduced his profile against the ground and allowed the natural geometry of the landscape to absorb him. He had a technique for the snow in front of the rifle barrel that was so specific and so deliberately engineered that it tells you everything about the quality of mind at work. Before settling into his final position, he would pour water into the snow immediately in front of the muzzle and allow it to freeze overnight into a solid crust. The purpose was precise. When a rifle fires, the expanding gases exiting the barrel, the muzzle blast, disturb loose snow in a radius that produces a visible disturbance. A visible disturbance is a position marker. A position marker is an invitation to mortar fire. The frozen crust absorbed the blast without movement, without cloud, without signal. He had thought through the system of his own survival to the level of the gases, leaving a barrel, and he had solved for it. He dressed entirely in white. This requires no elaboration beyond the contrast it presented. Soviet soldiers, due to a preparation failure that reflected the broader institutional failures of the Red Army in this war, were frequently issued standard brown and green uniforms. In the Karelian forest in winter, against snow that stretched in every direction to the tree line, a man in a dark coat was not a soldier. He was a target. He was a black dot against a white field, moving on a road he could not leave, toward a position he could not see. The cold at -40 degrees Celsius was not a backdrop. It was a participant. At -40, the human body produces vapor with every exhaled breath, a plume that rises in cold air with the unhelpful visibility of a signal fire. Snipers in the Winter War were detected this way regularly, their positions given away not by movement or sound, but by the simple biological fact of respiration. Heha kept snow in his mouth. This is a detail that does not become more comfortable the longer you hold it. Snow held against the teeth and tongue for hours. The progressive numbness, the body routing its warmth inward and away from the extremities. The breath cooled enough by the time it left his body that it did not rise, did not signal, did not exist, as far as anyone watching the tree line was concerned. He was not a man in the snow. He was snow, briefly, for as long as the position required it. He took no food or water into his position. Movement generates heat, and heat generates vapor, and vapor generates position. He entered a state of sustained biological suppression, 12 hours of immobility, that his body could perform because his body had been trained to it over 30 years of hunting birds that fled from anything less than absolute stillness. The agrarian endurance of a man who had worked through Finnish winters on a farm was not incidental to his survival on the front line. It was foundational to it. The cold that was killing Soviet soldiers, who had been issued inadequate clothing and no winter training, was the same cold he had been moving through and working in and simply living with for his entire life. He timed his shots to the ambient noise of the battlefield. This is the detail that separates a technically skilled marksman from someone who has thought through every variable in the system of their own concealment. Soviet artillery fired regularly. Heavy machinery moved along the forest roads. The battlefield was not silent. It had a rhythm, a texture of sound, and within that texture, there were moments when the report of a single rifle would not resolve into anything identifiable, would be absorbed by the larger noise, and leave no echo that could be located. He waited for those moments. He had been learning, on his father's farm, to read the conditions of a landscape before acting within them. He was reading the same conditions now, with the same patience, toward a different end. His rifle was the Finnish M2830, a civil guard variant of the Russian Mosin Nagant, produced with specific improvements. A better trigger mechanism, a thicker barrel, a more refined sighting system than the standard Soviet issue it would be measured against across the Kola front. He zeroed it for 150 meters, the standard engagement distance in the broken dense terrain of the forest, and within that zero, his body's learned sense of distance, the sense paced out over decades on Karelian farmland, did the work that optics would do for another marksman. He did not use a telescopic sight. This was not an oversight, and it was not stubbornness. It was a calculation made from 3 specific premises. A telescopic sight required him to raise his head several centimeters above the position his iron sights allowed. Several centimeters of additional profile in a war where Soviet counter-snipers were actively hunting Finnish marksmen was not an acceptable cost. The glass of 1930s-era optics fogged and iced in temperatures at which the Kola front regularly operated, rendering them unreliable at precisely the moments reliability mattered most. And sunlight striking the objective lens of a scope produced a reflection visible at significant distance, a flash of light against a white background that was as effective a position marker as the muzzle blast he had frozen into silence with water the night before. Iron sights were matte, low profile, and indifferent to cold. They worked at -40 because they had no glass to fail. The sniper narrative has consistently underweighted what happened when the distances closed. Heiha's division commander reported that he was responsible for more than 200 kills with the Suomi KP/31 submachine gun during close-quarters defensive actions, a number that approaches his documented rifle count, and that belongs to a completely different register of combat. The KP-31 was a high-quality Finnish-designed weapon with a 71-round drum magazine, capable of a high rate of fire, devastating in the tactical context of the Moti ambush. Finnish ski troops would materialize from the tree line, rake a Soviet column that had no room to maneuver on its narrow road, and disappear back into the white, before a coherent response was possible. Heiha participated in these engagements. He was not only a long-range precision instrument, he was a man who understood violence at multiple distances and moved between them as the situation required, with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. The Moti tactics and their operation deserve to be understood clearly, because the kill count does not exist outside the context that produced it. Large Soviet units, the 18th Division, the 34th Tank Brigade, formations of several thousand men, were cut off from their supply lines by Finnish ski detachments operating in the forests on either side of the roads. Once encircled, these units could not be resupplied and could not maneuver off the roads that had become their prisons. They were left systematically to starve and freeze while Finnish forces reduced them from the perimeter. Snipers operating in this context targeted officers and non-commissioned officers first. The chain of command broken deliberately, methodically, person by person, until the encircled unit lost the organizational coherence that made resistance possible and descended into the particular panic of men who are cold and hungry and no longer know who is in charge or what they are supposed to do. The Lemeti Moti resulted in approximately 12,000 Soviet casualties. The encircled divisions at Kola produced comparable figures. These were not abstractions in a strategic ledger. They were men from Soviet farms and Soviet cities who had been mobilized and transported to a forest they did not understand, in uniforms inadequate for the temperature, under officers whose positions owed more to political survival than to military experience. Some of them were ideological soldiers. Many of them were not. Many of them were farmers too, pulled from their own fields, and the distance between the man in the snow with the rifle and the men moving on the road below him was not the distance between a warrior and his enemies. It was, in some respects, that the myth has never been comfortable acknowledging, the distance between one kind of farmer and another. The kill count. Finnish army official documents recorded 259 sniper kills, attributed to Heiha by March the 7th, 1940. His division commander, Lieutenant General Antero Svensson, credited him with 219 rifle kills and approximately the same number of submachine gun kills by mid-February of that year, producing a combined figure of 438. The chaplain Antti Rantamaa documented higher figures in his diaries. Heiha's own private memoir, discovered in 2017, estimated the total at approximately 500. The rate of lethality at peak was extraordinary. More than 6 confirmed kills per day in the first 3 weeks of the war. The pace slowing as winter deepened and Soviet forces adapted to the reality of what was operating against them in the forest. The Finnish Ministry of Information was aware of these numbers as they accumulated and was aware of their value, not as a military report, but as a resource. A nation of 3.5 million people holding a line against an eventual Soviet force of more than 1.5 million needed something to hold on to. The numbers and the man producing them were that something. He did not know yet what the state was building around him. He was in the forest. He was doing the work. The sin list was growing entry by entry in the private arithmetic of a man who had chosen a specific word for what he was keeping track of, and that word was not victory, and not service, and not duty. It was sin. The forest at dusk. A figure in white, moving back through the trees from a position that has been occupied since before dawn, with the unhurried efficiency of someone whose day is finished, and who will return tomorrow to begin it again. Not celebrating, not suffering, or not visibly, simply present in the deliberate, self-contained way of someone who has made himself extraordinarily good at something and has not yet been asked to step outside the doing of it long enough to understand what it is. The sin list grows. The forest keeps the count with him in its own way. In the silence after a shot, in the particular quality of the air above a position that has been occupied for 12 hours by a man who cooled his breath with snow, in the frozen crust in front of a rifle barrel that has been poured and left and returned to in the dark. The forest does not judge. It simply holds what happens inside it, with the patient, absolute indifference of things that will still be here when the war is over and the records have been disputed and the myth has been built and the man has returned, if he returns, to the only kind of company that ever made complete sense to him. Somewhere in Helsinki, in the winter of 1939 to 1940, men in warm offices were doing a different kind of arithmetic. The Finnish Ministry of Information understood the war in 2 registers simultaneously. There was the military register, the actual state of the front lines, the casualty figures, the rate at which Finnish reserves were being consumed, the diplomatic horizon and how close or far it was. And there was the public register. What the Finnish people could be permitted to know, what they could be asked to bear, what shape the narrative of the war needed to hold in order to keep a nation of 3.5 million people functioning as a coherent society, while the Red Army pressed against every available border with a force that would eventually number more than 1.5 million soldiers. These two registers were not the same document. The men in the Warm Offices understood this, and they managed the distance between them with the practiced efficiency of people who have decided that a useful story is more valuable than a complete one. What they needed was not a strategy. They had a strategy. What they needed was a face. The Finnish press had been printing names and numbers since the first weeks of the war. The small dispatches from various fronts, the official counts, the language of measured confidence that wartime communication requires even when the underlying situation does not fully support it. Into this environment, the figures surrounding a sniper operating on the Kolar front began to accumulate in a way that made the men in the Warm Offices pay attention. The numbers were extraordinary. The source was, from a propaganda perspective, nearly perfect. He was a farmer's son from the rural southeast, Lutheran, humble in the specific photogenic way of men who do not seek attention, who give interviews in sparse sentences and deflect questions about their own abilities with a quiet that reads in print as modesty of the highest order. He embodied sisu, the Finnish concept of stoic, resilient determination, without being asked to perform it, without even appearing to know that he was embodying anything. He was small and plain, and from a place no one had heard of, and he was doing something that the newspapers could attach a number to. And the number was growing every week, and the number was the thing the public could hold on to when everything else was uncertain. The chaplain Antti Rantama was keeping diaries. His figures for Heihas kills were higher than the official military records. Not fabricated, but drawn from a wider accounting than the strict confirmations the army's formal documentation required. A confirmed kill in the official record needed a third-party witness, which in the chaos of a Motti engagement in dense forest was frequently impossible to produce. The chaplain's counts were looser, more comprehensive, and significantly larger. These figures found their way into the press with the assistance of people who understood the difference between what a number needed to be true and what it needed to do. The Finnish press built the myth with the materials available and the understanding of what the myth was for. The name, the White Death, appeared in Finnish newspapers attached to a sniper on the Kolar front, and the name was good because it was the kind of name that a legend requires. Simple, cold, absolute. It had the quality of something inevitable, something that had always been waiting to be applied to the right subject. The articles described an invisible marksman whom the Red Army could not locate and could not stop, a ghost in the forest, a force of nature in the shape of man. They were not entirely wrong. They were not entirely right. They were useful. The White Death nickname requires its own examination, because the story of where it came from is itself a story the myth got wrong. The common account is straightforward. Soviet soldiers, terrified of the unseen Finnish sniper, gave him the name Belayasmert, White Death, in fear and grudging acknowledgement of his lethality. This is a clean narrative. It has the shape of a legend and the emotional logic of one. What prisoner interrogations and Soviet archival material suggest is more complicated and considerably less flattering to the myth. To the average Soviet conscript in the Karelian forest in the winter of 1939 to 1940, White Death was not a man. It was the frost, The cold that winter killed men in numbers that rivaled the combat casualties, took fingers and toes and whole bodies, with the unhurried thoroughness of something that required no marksmanship and observed no front lines. Soviet soldiers, inadequately dressed for subarctic conditions, sitting in vehicles that had stopped functioning on roads that had become dead ends, in encirclements where supply lines were cut and fires could not be, lit without revealing a position. These men were being killed by the temperature as systematically as they were being killed by Finnish rifles. The white death they spoke of was this: the white cold, the killing winter, the relentless specific enemy that was the Finnish climate itself. The attribution of the name to a single sniper did not appear in Finnish literature until the 1980s, 4 decades after the war, long after the man himself had receded into the reclusion of a farm in Ruokolahti and stopped correcting anyone about anything. By then the name had been on the man, long enough that the original referent had been forgotten, and the myth had the name it wanted. What the myth required of the man, practically, was that he continue to be what it needed him to be, which was, primarily, a number. The kill count was the myth's foundation. Everything else, the humble origins, the Lutheran stoicism, the iron sights, the white camouflage, was architecture. Built on top of that foundation, detail added to make the number legible as a human story rather than a statistic. The number was managed. The Ministry of Information was aware that morale is a resource that can be spent faster than it is earned, and they managed the spending carefully, releasing figures at intervals calculated to sustain belief without outrunning the credibility of the source. The count as published was always high enough to be astonishing, and never so high as to exceed what a reasonable person might accept. And then, in mid-February of 1940, Field Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim came to the Kolar front. Mannerheim was the supreme commander of the Finnish Defense Forces and the figure around whom Finnish national identity in this war had crystallized. A man whose bearing in history carried the weight of the country's entire military self-conception. He came to decorate a corporal. He promoted Heiha directly from corporal to second lieutenant in a single step, the fastest field promotion in the history of the Finnish military, a leap across multiple ranks that the chain of command required a specific, deliberate dispensation to execute. He presented him with a rifle. The rifle was engraved with his name. This moment is worth holding, because it is the moment where the myth and the man are most visibly in contact and most visibly in tension. Heiha stood in his uniform and accepted the formal architecture of Finnish heroism from the most powerful military figure in the country: the medal, the rank, the engraved rifle, the language of service and sacrifice and national gratitude. He stood in it, with the same spare quietness he brought to everything. He gave no speech. He said what was required and no more. The photographers recorded a man who looked, in the images, like someone who was being patient about something. In private, he was keeping a list he had named after a concept from the religion he had grown up in. Not a victory list, not a service record, a sin list. The word is the thing. It is not a metaphor, and it is not false modesty, and it is not the rhetorical self-deprecation of a man performing humility for an audience. It is a theological term, chosen by a Lutheran farmer, with the specific, unironic relationship to Lutheran theology that men of his background and generation carried. A term that locates what he was counting in a moral category, that refuses the language of achievement and insists on the language of transgression. 500 entries, give or take, in a list he called a sin list. The Ministry of Information would not have found this useful. They were not told. The Soviet side of the equation was the side the Finnish press did not render in detail, The men moving on the forest roads were, in a significant number of cases, not the ideological soldiers of Soviet propaganda. They were conscripts, farmers, factory workers, men pulled from their ordinary lives and transported to a winter environment they had no training for, in uniforms inadequate for the temperature, under officers whose own positions were the product of a purge rather than a career. The 18th Division, the 34th Tank Brigade, the men of the encircled formations at Lemeti and Kola, sitting in the cold, running out of food, listening to the forest, and not being able to hear what was inside it. Approximately 12,000 Soviet casualties at Lemeti alone. The total Soviet dead for the Winter War reached figures that Soviet records kept sealed for decades, and that, when they were eventually opened, were larger than the official wartime accounting had suggested. These men had families. They had farms. They had the ordinary furniture of ordinary lives waiting for them at a distance that the war was making permanent. They were being killed by the cold and by the systematic tactical competence of a smaller force that understood the terrain, and by a sniper who lay in the snow for 12 hours at a time and cooled his breath with snow in his mouth, and had given his kill count a name that the newspapers were not reporting. The myth needed none of this. The myth needed the number and the name and the image of a small, quiet farmer who was saving his country with iron sights and patience. The myth was not wrong exactly. It was incomplete in the specific way of useful things, trimmed to the shape of what it needed to do. The edges where it became complicated, smoothed away, and left somewhere the public would not think to look. Heiha continued to go into the forest. He continued to do what the forest and the war required of him. The sin list continued to grow. The newspapers continued to print the number, the name, the adjectives of national heroism. The distance between the private accounting and the public one widened with every week, in the specific way that a myth widens from the person it is built around. Not through lies exactly, but through the accumulated pressure of a story that needs to be a certain shape and that bends everything it touches toward that shape. He was in the forest. He was the myth. He was neither one entirely. In the gap between them, in the space between the man lying still in the snow with his breath cooled to nothing, and the legend printed in Helsinki with its clean numbers and its satisfying name, something was accumulating that was not glory and was not guilt, but was closer to the second than the first, and that the man himself had already found the right word for. He had been calling it sin since before anyone thought to ask him what he called it. The forest held his counsel. The newspaper held his number. And the winter, which was the original White Death, and had been doing its work long before anyone thought to give the work a face, pressed on through the trees with the absolute impersonal efficiency of something that does not require a name to do what it does. The 105th day of the Winter War arrived the way the other 104 had arrived. In darkness and cold, in the specific quality of a Karelian winter morning that has stopped being remarkable because it has been the same morning in all its essential conditions for more than 3 months. March the 6th, 1940, the Ulisma sector of the Kolia front. The Finnish and Soviet lines had been pressing against each other across this ground since the first weeks of December, and the pressure had produced, over those months, the particular landscape of a front that has been fought over repeatedly without resolution. Broken trees, disturbed snow, the geography of a place that has been argued about in the most literal possible way, and has absorbed the argument into itself without settling it. The birches that had stood whole in November were splintered now at their midsections, broken by artillery that did not distinguish between trees and men. The snow that had been pristine in the first days of the war had been worked over 104 days of fighting into something different, compacted and darkened in the places where the front had been most active, stained in ways that snow is not supposed to be stained, holding in its compressed layers the record of everything that had passed through it. The engagement that morning was close. Not the long geometries of the sniper's preferred work, not the 150-meter calculation. The breath cooled to nothing. The frozen crust in front of the barrel, the unhurried alignment of everything into the single moment of a shot, timed to artillery noise. This was the forest at close quarters, which is a different kind of violence entirely, compressed, chaotic, operating in the space between trees where sightlines collapse to meters rather than hundreds of meters, where the organizational clarity of a prepared position dissolves into the immediate, specific emergency of men, fighting in confined space with no distance to manage. The Ulisma counterattack was part of a broader Finnish effort to relieve pressure on the Kolar line in the war's final days, when the diplomatic situation had deteriorated to the point where the Finnish High Command understood that a treaty was coming, and that the terms of that treaty would be shaped by the position of the front lines when the negotiations concluded. Men were dying in March of 1940 to influence the placement of a border that was already being drawn in a room in Moscow. Heihe was in the trees. A Soviet soldier was in the trees. The distance between them, when the shot was fired, was close enough that what the bullet carried into the impact was not the attenuated force of a long trajectory, but something close to its full original energy, directed at the lower left side of his face. The projectile was an explosive round, a bullet designed to fragment on impact, to distribute its force across a wider area of damage than a standard round would produce. What it produced, in the lower left jaw and cheek of a man who had been lying in the Finnish snow since before the war gave him a name, was destruction of a completeness that the soldiers who found him afterward did not immediately process as survivable. The lower left cheek was gone. A significant portion of the upper jaw was gone. Nearly the entire lower jaw was gone. The face that the Finnish newspapers had been printing alongside their numbers was no longer, in any meaningful sense, present. What remained was a wound so severe that the men who found him understood it, in the rapid triage of soldiers who have been making these assessments for 105 days, as a wound that belonged to a body rather than a person. They placed him on a pile of corpses. This is not a detail that softens with repetition. The soldiers who found him assessed what they saw, with the pragmatic efficiency of men who had been making these assessments in conditions that had compressed their tolerance for ambiguity, and they concluded that what they were looking at was a body. He was placed accordingly. It was a fellow soldier who noticed at some point in the interval between finding him and moving on that one of his legs was moving. A small motion, the involuntary movement of a body that had not yet received the information that it was supposed to have stopped. And a small motion was enough on that morning to change everything that came after. He was evacuated. He entered a coma that lasted 7 days. He regained consciousness on March the 13th, 1940. The Winter War ended on March the 13th, 1940. The timing of this, the man waking from the coma, produced by the wound that ended his war on the same day that the treaty ended the war itself, has the quality of a detail a writer would be advised against including in a fiction, because it exceeds what fiction is permitted to. Ask an audience to accept. It is not fiction. It is the specific indifferent coincidence of a history that does not arrange itself for legibility or emotional tidiness, that produces its most devastating ironies, not through design, but through the simple mechanical collision of events that have no awareness of each other. He woke up. The war was over. Both of these things were true on the same morning, and neither of them softened the other. And the room he woke into, hospital white, still the particular silence of a ward where men are recovering from things that cannot be fully recovered from, held both facts simultaneously, without resolving them into anything that made sense. He woke up to find himself a national hero in a nation that had just signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, ceding to the Soviet Union the Karelian territory that the war had been fought, in significant part to defend, the Karelian Isthmus, the territories that the Finnish negotiators had refused to surrender in the autumn of 1939, the refusal that had precipitated the shelling of Mainila and the crossing of the border and the 105 days of the Winter War and everything those days contained. The territory that a corporal from Rautjärvi had been promoted to second lieutenant for helping to hold was now, by the terms of the treaty signed on the morning he opened his eyes, Soviet territory. The farm in Rautjärvi, the fields his father had taught him to pace, the forest where he had learned to read wind through the upper branches before it reached the ground, the landscape that had made him precisely what the war had required him to be, was on the other side of a new border. He had killed, by the various accountings, somewhere between 259 and 500 men. He had done this in the forest around the Kola River, in the snow, in temperatures at minus 40 degrees Celsius, with iron sights and a frozen muzzle crust, and snow held in, his mouth against his teeth. He had done it to hold a line that would protect the land he had grown up working, the specific particular land of Karelian Finland. He woke up to find that land was now on the other side of a Soviet border. The reconstruction of his face required 26 major surgical operations, conducted over years. The results were partial in the way that surgical results in the 1940s were partial, bounded by the limits of technique and material, and the fundamental biological fact that certain kinds of destruction, once produced, leave an absence that can be worked around but not filled. His face was rebuilt to the extent that the era permitted, which was to a degree that was functional and to a degree that was, by any ordinary measure, severely disfigured. His speech was permanently impaired. The structures required for normal articulation, the jaw, the palate, the arrangement of tissues that allows a human being to shape sound into language, were too compromised by the original wound and the subsequent surgeries to be fully restored. He had been, before the war, a man of spare words. He became, after it, a man for whom the production of words carried a physical cost that had not been there before, an additional friction between the thought and its expression that the myth of the silent, stoic Finn never needed to account for, because the myth did not require that level of specificity. He was 34 years old. When the war ended, he would live to 96. The arithmetic of that, 62 years of a reconstructed face and impaired speech, and the permanent low-level physical reality of injuries that do not resolve, but simply become the background condition of a life, is the arithmetic the myth has consistently declined to perform. The legend ends in March of 1940 with the wound and the coma and the waking and the treaty. The man continued for 62 years after that. Those 62 years are the part of the story that is least told and most true. He was a national hero. He received the Knight of the Mannerheim Cross. He had been promoted directly from corporal to second lieutenant by the supreme commander of the Finnish Defence Forces and presented with an engraved rifle. The formal architecture of Finnish heroism had been built around him with considerable care and considerable public investment, and that architecture did not disappear when the war ended. It calcified into permanence, the kind of permanence that national heroes acquire when the nation has a continuing need for the symbol they represent, when the story of a man becomes public property, and the man himself becomes, in a meaningful sense, secondary to the story. And then, the anonymous letters began arriving. Hate mail, death threats, the return address of grievance, Finnish communists, families who had lost sons in a war they had concluded was unnecessary or poorly managed, people who looked at the personification of Finland's wartime will and found in that personification not a hero, but an embodiment of everything the war had cost and everything it had not preserved. The national hero, whose status did not protect him from the verdict of the people on the other side of the ledger. People who had run the same arithmetic as the Ministry of Information and arrived at a different conclusion about whose name should be at the bottom of the equation. The letters arrived at the farm with the ordinary indifference of the postal system, which does not distinguish between correspondence that is welcome and correspondence that is not, and Heha received them with the same sparse quietness he brought to everything, and he did not respond publicly to any of them. He did not give interviews about the letters. He did not issue statements. He took the state-granted farm in Ruokolahti, in the South Karelia region, south of the new border, on the Finnish side of the territory. The treaty had redrawn, and he moved there, and he bred dogs, and he hunted moose. The moose hunting is the detail that belongs at the center of any honest account of the post-war Heha. He returned to the forest, not as a figure of anything, not as a symbol in motion through a landscape, but as a man who had found, over the course of a life that began and ended in the same essential relationship with the same essential place, that the forest was the only environment in which he was fully himself. He returned to the patience and the stillness and the long communion with a landscape that communicated in a language he had always found more legible than the language of people, distance and wind, and the specific quality of silence that tells you where something is before you can see it. The violence of the war had not made him a violent man, had not produced in him the restless aggression or the compulsive reliving that breaks some soldiers. It had produced instead a deepening of the withdrawal that had always been his natural direction, a more complete retreat into the forest and the animals, and the satisfying wordless grammar of a life organized around attention to things that did not require him to explain himself. His friend Kalevi Ekkonen said that Simo spoke more with animals in the forest than with people. This was not offered as a diagnosis or a criticism. It was offered as an observation by someone who knew him well enough to describe him accurately, and its accuracy is what makes it stay. He had come back from a war that had made him, briefly and against his inclination, the most publicly documented killer in the history of major warfare. A man whose name had been in every Finnish newspaper, whose number had been managed by a government ministry, whose face had been photographed and printed and placed alongside adjectives of national heroism, and he had come back to find that he had no particular relationship to any of it. The public Heha was a construction he had not participated in building and did not recognize as himself. The private Heha was a man who bred dogs and hunted moose and moved through a forest with the unhurried, self-contained efficiency of someone for whom the forest was not a setting but a home. He rarely discussed his kills in the decades after the war. When he did, the language he reached for was the language of duty, brief, deflective, designed to close the subject as cleanly as possible. He did what he was told, as well as he could. This sentence has the shape of a satisfactory answer, and the texture, on examination, of something more careful than it appears. The verbal equivalent of the white camouflage, the surface that presents nothing for a visitor to locate, the practiced absence of anything that could be used as a position marker. It tells you what he chose to show, and nothing about what lay beneath. He had been doing this since the war, presenting the minimum required surface to the world that wanted to look at him, and reserving the interior for a document that was not written for anyone else. In 2017, 15 years after his death in 2002 at the age of 96, a private memoir was discovered. He had written it himself, in the plain, private language of a man accounting to no audience. In it, he documented his kills under a heading he had chosen, without irony, and without the performance of humility, and without any apparent awareness that the word he had selected would, when the document was eventually found, say more about the gap between the man and the myth than anything written about him in the decades since the war. He called it his sin list. The term is a Lutheran one. This matters. It carries specific theological weight that the casual English translation does not fully convey. Not the mild self-deprecation of a modest man waving away a compliment, but the formal moral vocabulary of a religious tradition that draws a clear and serious line between what a person has done and what the law of God requires. A sin, in this vocabulary, is not a mistake or an error of judgment. It is a transgression against a known standard, a departure from what ought to have been. A sin list is the document you keep when you need to account for yourself to something larger than the state that promoted you, and the newspapers that printed your number, and the supreme commander who put his name on a rifle and gave it to you. He kept it for 62 years. He kept it through 26 surgeries, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the slow reopening of archives that revealed the figures on the other side of his accounting. The Soviet casualties of the Winter War, larger than the official wartime numbers, the records of men whose families had received form letters in the 1940s, and whose deaths had been classified and filed, and not fully acknowledged for decades. He kept it through the hate mail, and the state honors, and the moose in the forest, and the long quiet accumulation of years on a farm south of the border his war had failed to preserve. He did not update his word for it to fit any of the reorganizations history performed around it in those 62 years. He had his word. He had written it down. The sin list was what it was. The private document beneath the public myth. The accounting that existed in the space between what the Ministry of Information had built and what the man inside that construction had always known about himself. The farm in Roccolati, the dogs, the moose in the forest, the impaired voice and the reconstructed face and the decades of a life that the legend had not accounted for because legends end at the interesting part and do not follow their subjects into the long ordinary aftermath. He lived into the 21st century. He was alive when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the geopolitical event he had been used to resist reorganized itself into history. He was alive when the archives began to open and the fuller picture of the Winter War began to assemble itself from the documents that had been classified for 50 years. He gave one of his last interviews in 2001, a year before his death. He was 95 years old. He sat in his home in Roccolati, in the South Karelia that was still Finnish, and he spoke with the care of a man for whom speaking carried a physical cost, and he said what he had always said. He did what he was told. He did it as well as he could. The forest kept the rest. The story is told every year, in one form or another. A farmer from a place no one had heard of, a rifle he had competed with since his 20s, iron sights in a war where everyone else used glass, white camouflage against a Soviet army that wore brown and green into a white forest, 500 kills, give or take, in 105 days. The name the cold gave him, or the name the newspapers gave him, or the name that attached itself to him sometime in the 1980s, and has not let go since. The story is told with the clean lines of a legend, the humble origins, the impossible number, the nation saved by a single extraordinary will, and it holds its shape well because it was built to hold its shape, built by people who understood that a useful story needs clean lines and a face, and a number large enough to be astonishing without being large enough to exceed belief. What the clean lines leave out is everything that does not fit inside them, the snow in the mouth, the 12 hours of immobility in -40-degree cold, the frozen crust poured in front of a rifle barrel the night before, so that the morning shot would not announce itself in a cloud of disturbed white, the sin list, The specific word, the theological word, the word a Lutheran farmer chose when he was alone with a notebook and had no one to perform humility for, and no myth to maintain, and nothing left to be, except honest about what he had been keeping track of and what he had decided to call it. 26 surgeries, the impaired voice, the anonymous letters arriving at a farm south of a border that the war had failed to preserve, 62 years of an aftermath that the legend ended before it began, because legends do not follow their subjects into the long, ordinary reckoning of what remains when the interesting part is over. He hunted moose. He bred dogs. He moved through the forest with the same patience he had carried into it as a boy, learning to read the wind, through the upper branches, learning to become less present than the landscape around him, learning that the world comes to you if you are still enough to receive it. The forest did not change its terms for what the war had made of him. It required the same stillness, the same attention, the same willingness to be patient beyond the point where patience is comfortable. He gave it these things for 62 years, and the forest kept its counsel, as it always had, as it always does. He died on April the 1st, 2002. He was 96 years old. The Soviet Union he had fought was already 11 years dissolved. The archives that had been sealed since the war had been partially opened, and the figures inside them were larger than the wartime accounting had suggested, and the fuller picture of the Winter War was still assembling itself from the documents of both sides, the Finnish and the Soviet, the decorated and the unnamed. The border drawn in March of 1940, Vion, had moved again in the decades after the war, and then settled, and the farm in Rautjärvi remained on the wrong side of it. 15 years after his death, someone found the memoir. The sin list was there, written in his own hand, in the plain private language of a man accounting to no audience. Beneath a heading he had not chosen carelessly. Everything the myth had smoothed over was there in that word. The distance between the number the newspapers printed and the number the man himself kept. The distance between the public language of service and duty and the private language of transgression and weight. He had been carrying it since the war. He had written it down. He had given it the right name and kept it in a place where it would not be found until he was no longer present to be asked about it, which may have been the final act of the same art he had practiced in the snow. The art of being present without being readable, of keeping the most important thing in a place that required the most careful attention to find. This is not the story the Finnish state told. It is not the story the newspapers printed in the winter of 1939 to 1940, alongside the numbers and the adjectives of heroism. It is not the story that ends with the engraved rifle and the Knight of the Mannerheim Cross, and the Supreme Commander's hand on the shoulder of a small, quiet man from Rautjärvi. It is the other story, the one that was always there, beneath the first one, kept in the same patient silence the man kept everything that mattered. The one that waited, as he had always waited, for the right conditions to be found. The forest is still there. The cold is still there. The snow still carries its own interior light in winter, still integrates everything placed into it eventually, still keeps its counsel with the absolute, impersonal patience of things that have no stake in what happens on their surface. And somewhere in the white, if you are still enough to look, if you have learned as he learned, to see what is present rather than what is shown, there is a figure that is barely a disturbance, keeping his list, keeping his silence, waiting for the world to be quiet enough to understand what he called it and why.